Hey everybody, my guest today is Dr. Raffael Fasel, and we're going to talk about animal rights. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
All right, so you recently wrote a book on animal rights called More Equal Than Others, and I was hoping that you could give a brief summary.
Absolutely. So the starting point of my book are the recent litigation efforts that we have seen around the world, but including in the US, where animal rights advocates have brought cases for animals in zoos for the most part. So some of your listeners may have heard about the Happy case. Happy is an elephant in the Bronx Zoo, and an organization called the Non-Human Rights Project has filed a so-called habeas corpus petition on her behalf. So this is basically asking a court to have a close look at the captivity of Happy and to decide whether to move her to a sanctuary because, as the organization was arguing, she might be an autonomous being that has legal personhood. What my book is doing is it's asking what these claims for animal rights are doing or might be doing to human rights, because some people are worried that if we grant animal rights, animal personhood, legal personhood to animals, then what we're doing is watering down human rights. And the book looks at the history of these claims. It traces the sort of roots of these counterclaims back to the 18th century in the French Enlightenment, showing that we have people arguing for animal rights in the French Enlightenment and people arguing against animal rights on the ground that it could undermine human rights already back then. It then tries to spell out the conceptual differences between the different views that are underlying the animal rights people's arguments and also the human rights folks' arguments, and I construct two ideal types that I'm sure we have more time to go into later. And then lastly is trying to draw some practical conclusions, and the practical conclusion of the book is that there are very good reasons for extending some rights to animals, but this should be done on the basis of their species membership rather than their individual capacities, and that helps address some of the concerns that human rights folks have. So that's just a very brief overview of the book.
Really interesting. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. So as far as I understand it, you're kind of looking at the legal implications of, in philosophy, where we talk about the argument for marginal cases, right? So you're like, some people will say, well, we should grant animals certain rights if they possess certain capacities. Like, oh, dogs can do this. Maybe elephants are rational. Maybe they mourn for their dead. And that means that they have some level of agency and they're to a certain extent, they're rational beings, right? And since personhood is kind of based on this rational being status, we want to grant that to maybe particular elephants. But then the worry is like, oh, what if some human beings don't possess those capacities? Does that mean that they're not persons? Does that mean that they shouldn't be protected under the law, just like other human beings? So you're kind of seeing what the legal implication of that argument is. Am I correct?
That's exactly right, Jason. So what I'm saying in the book is that if we look at animal rights scholarship, animal rights proposals, including the litigation efforts that I've alluded to earlier when talking about the Happy case, they're based on what I call a meritocratic conception of rights, where roughly the idea is if you as an individual have the relevant capacities that we take to ground certain rights, then at least prima facie you deserve that right. So take Happy. If Happy is shown to be an autonomous creature with personhood in the philosophical sense that you were pointing to, Jason, then prima facie at least she might deserve a right to be, free, or at least be moved to a sanctuary where she has more space to roam around. But once we adopt this meritocratic approach, as I call it, this sort of moral individualism, if you like, in philosophical parlance, then you do run the problem that some humans might not have some of the capacities that we currently take to ground rights that humans have, or they might have them to a lesser extent than other humans or perhaps even other animals. So maybe there are human beings out there, in fact, not just maybe, there are human beings out there who don't have autonomy to the same degree as an elephant, right? So what do we do with humans, and what does that do to equality in the legal sense, where human rights doctrine and scholarship and practice tells us we're all equal as human beings. We all have the same human rights and to the same extent. So what does that do to that understanding of equality once we go down the meritocratic path?
Yeah. I've always found, I guess, the capacity approach to be quite appealing. Like, if you were to tell me, this elephant or elephants in general have these capacities that we normally attribute to persons, then I'm willing to grant that they're persons. And if that's the case, I think they do deserve to be protected, and I think they do deserve certain rights appropriate to their personhood. And I guess I'm not too moved by the concern with that approach, because let's say that there are many human beings that don't rise to that level of personhood, like infants, right? But that's only because they're very young. So perhaps this is the next step that you take in the book, which is, well, we should grant rights based on species membership. Is that your kind of your compromise with the people who are concerned about like the specialness of human beings?
Yes and no. So it's true that I'm arguing for the species membership approach, but what I'm suggesting is that this is an approach it's a legally useful approach. It's a politically and sort of practically expedient approach in law. Now, what do I mean by this? Something that we're seeing in animal rights law now is legal scholars and lawyers building on the rich sort of corpus that ethicists, philosophers have built, but that reaches its limits when it comes to the technicalities, the intricacies of how law actually works. So just to give you an example, Jason, you spoke about personhood. And what courts are doing is they're not necessarily equating philosophical personhood, being a person, being autonomous, with personhood in the legal sense, because there are legal persons that are not moral persons or philosophical persons. Think of corporations. They're an abstract entity that are recognized as legal persons. In fact, they even have certain human rights. They have a right to property. They have a right to religious freedom, even in some countries, including the US. So legal personhood and philosophical personhood, if we want to call it that, don't necessarily overlap. And the law has some flexibility. Indeed, some might say has complete sort of freedom in, declaring that something is a legal person, even if it's got no connection at all to philosophical personhood. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to say the critique of speciesism, for instance, in the moral philosophical context, it makes a lot of sense, but perhaps the law works differently from how, sort of philosophical ideas work. And as inspired that we need to be with or from these ideas, as lawyers, for those of you who are lawyers listening in, we also need to work with what the law is giving us. And here in the law, working with a species membership criterion, as speciesist as it may be, can actually be a useful way of sort of boosting both animal rights and human rights.
So how does the law understand personhood?
It's a very good question, Jason. It depends on each jurisdiction. It may depend on each and every judge and how they, are willing to understand it and to which entities they're willing to extend legal personhood protections. To be fair, a lot of judges aren't really confronted with these kinds of questions because they're only dealing with cases involving humans or, corporations. The happy case and other animal rights cases are so fascinating because they are requiring the judges to reassess their assumptions, their conceptions, their understandings of fundamental concepts such as legal personhood, asking the very question that you're asking now, Jason. But yes, for the most part, so far, legal personhood has been sort of limited to natural persons, i.e. humans, and was sometimes called juristic persons, i.e. corporations. But animal rights lawyers are arguing, well, what's stopping us from, recognizing some animals as legal persons? Because that might be the necessary step for them to have rights resembling human rights. But that too is a matter of some debate whether that's necessary at all. Perhaps we don't need to have legal personhood for animals in the first place. Maybe we should go for rights directly.
Interesting. So we're forcing judges to do philosophy, and they're not used to it. They're like, oh, I don't know what a person is. Let me ask a philosopher and see if we should change the law accordingly. So what's the resistance to that? I mean, at least from the judge's perspective, like why wouldn't they want to grant legal personhood to, elephants and dolphins and stuff like that?
It has ramifications. Now, I just said that there's, disagreement as to whether or not legal personhood is necessary. But at the end of the day, in a case like Happy, if Happy is recognized as a legal person, then she has the right to bodily autonomy under habeas corpus. And that gives her the right to be moved to the sanctuary that the Non-Human Rights Project was arguing she should be moved to, because she was being held captive really without any good, grounds. So it has practical ramifications, and judges are worried, and they tell us explicitly that they're worried about opening the floodgates as they see it, right? So they're saying, well, it's Happy now, but it could be your dog next, and then it could be the chickens that we're raising in, sort of factory farm conditions. So this thing has implications that, are really, all of this is going too far. There are responses from the animal rights side to this, with people saying, look, habeas corpus, for instance, is a very limited tool. It is limited to autonomous beings. So if there are animals that, are raised, horrifically and killed, but that are not autonomous, then habeas corpus isn't available to them. Maybe some other legal tool is, but this one here isn't. So we're broadly dealing with sort of floodgates concerns and whether or not they're warranted.
I guess I need to ask some judges, but why is that a concern for a judge? Why is the judge concerned about slippery slope arguments? Like, aren't they just supposed to interpret the law and try to, make a judgment in regards to what's legal or not legal? If it's, dolphins next, then it's like, okay, and? Why do you as a judge even care about whether or not it applies to dolphins next or chimpanzees next?
I think it's an excellent point, and it's what quite a few people are arguing. They're saying, look, if this is what the law demands, if this is what justice demands, that this principle naturally extends to dolphins or chimpanzees or whoever, then this is what the principle demands, and it is your role to apply it that way. Now, the judges, just giving you one example here, so the New York Court of Appeals 2 years ago reached a final decision in the Happy case where the majority argued that, this is really the place for the legislature to come in, right? The majority was arguing that this has such momentous consequences that it's not really our role as judges to make that step. It is for the legislature to do that. Again, there are people arguing against this, saying, look, if your role as the judge is to apply these principles and this is what the principles mean, then you should go for it. But this is how the court and some other courts have tried to find a way out.
Yeah, I feel like if you're resistant to this as a judge, then it's because you're coming into this discussion with certain assumptions about the specialness of human beings, right? So let's say I'm going to think about the U.S. context. Let's say 150 years ago or something like that. We're talking about the right to vote. It's like, and the argument is, oh no, if you're a rational being, you should be able to vote, but then the judges are like, but if we grant this to women, then we're going to have to grant this to black people too. Like, where's this going to lead us? And it's like, okay, why? What's the problem with that? You know what I mean? And that you as the judge shouldn't be worried about those implications unless you are already starting with certain assumptions that those groups should not have those rights.
I think it's a great observation, and it's one that's mirrored in an interesting way in the New York Appellate Division's decision on an earlier case on a different animal, also brought by the Non-Human Rights Project. And this court tried to spell out why they thought legal personhood does not apply to non-humans. And the argument they were giving, sort of drawing on philosophy, as you were saying earlier, was that if you want to have rights, you need to be able to reciprocate duties, right? So they're drawing on a sort of, social contract type argument, saying that all humans are able to sort of, engage in sort of duties, they have responsibilities towards others, and therefore they deserve rights. Of course, the courts added a footnote saying, okay, we realize there's, there are children out there too, and there's some human beings, marginal cases type argument that you were referring to earlier, where this could be a bit of an issue. And the response to that concern was something along the lines of, well, so what? They're still human, right? So, yeah, exactly. I think this is reflective of the assumptions that are baked into these very rulings.
The reason why I'm laughing is because I sometimes make this joke with my philosopher friends, right? Is that some people's approaches to doing, philosophical reasoning is that they start with the conclusion first and then try to rationalize backwards, right? It's like whatever that threshold for rational beings is, well, first I'm included. Whatever that bar is, it's going to be, I'm going to be included, right? And the people who I care about, they're also included, right? And so you start with this conclusion and then you work yourself backwards. And I'm just like, that's just not the way to do it. You should start with first principles, right? And then you just follow the logic. But it just seems that people are unwilling to do that because this adherence to the specialness of human beings is just so core, And this is why I think this criticism of speciesism is so powerful, because it really does question it, And you have really smart people, like, right? These judges and lawyers, they're all smart people, and they'll face this problem. They'd be like, but they're still humans, And it's just like they have all this beautiful reasoning and years of, education. All right, they're experts on this stuff, and then at the end they just kind of pack in this exception. It's just really messy, right? You have this beautiful theory, beautifully argued, and then just like this little caveat at the end. It's just so ugly. It doesn't fit with anything else that you're saying.
Yeah, and I think what animal rights lawyers and litigators have realized to their frustration is that you can adduce the best arguments, you can bring in, the best experts, and the courts might still rule against you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's really annoying because, a judicial decision at the end of the day, it's not a philosophy seminar. No one's going to quiz you on the sort of philosophical robustness of your argument. Or people might quiz you, but it's in a case note, and the judges don't bother about the case notes so much, and it's too late. The case has been decided. So, and that gets us back to our, earlier discussion about the sort of the differences between philosophy and law in this context, and how I think animal rights litigators and animal rights scholars need to be conscious of the limitations, but perhaps also opportunities that the legal toolbox and the political system, I suppose, more broadly offers them.
This might be another unanswerable question because it's going to depend on the judge and the jurisdiction, but how does the law understand autonomous being?
Again, I don't think I have a satisfactory answer to that, because it will depend on the jurisdiction. It will depend on the concrete instrument that's being used. So take again habeas corpus. Habeas corpus has an interesting history of being applied to children, for instance, moving them from one sort of problematic household to maybe a foster family, right? So again, similar idea. You're in an environment that's bad for you. You're now being moved away to sort of, in this case, is it really to promote your autonomy? If you're a child that's very young, perhaps you don't have that autonomy yet. And yet, in some contexts, courts have been willing to apply habeas corpus. So I guess we have the difficulty here not only of sort of, it's a moving target in terms of the definitions that they're using, and also the underlying anthropocentrism that comes in and that might make the tool more applicable to perhaps humans who lack autonomy, but not applicable to animals that arguably have autonomy. It's challenging.
I remember watching an interview of Stephen Wise, I think the founder of the Non-Human Rights Project.
Correct.
And he was explaining that, look, according to the law, there are two categories. You're either a person or a thing. Things can be owned, persons cannot be owned. And that's kind of like the framework that he was operating with. So of these two things, animals were in the category of things. And so in order to give animals their rights, you had to move them to the other category. Is that your understanding as well?
It is a prominent understanding, and I think it has something going for it. So this is the understanding that underlies this assumption that I mentioned earlier, that you need to recognize animals as legal persons before you can properly protect them with rights, right? In other words, you need to move them from the thing category to the person category, and only then can they have rights. I can, go later into what some of the reasons are that I think speak in favor of this view. But perhaps before we go there, it's helpful to sort of look at the contrasting view that's become more prominent in recent years, which basically says, look, animals as things are already quite well protected, at least in certain jurisdictions. And depending on your definition of rights, you can call these protections that animals have rights, at least in a sort of simple or a thin way, right? So take the protection that animals have in many jurisdictions from being slaughtered without prior stunning. So in most jurisdictions that have animal protection laws, not all countries have them, but let's just work with those that have them. If you are sending an animal for slaughter, you need to stun the animal, you need to anesthetize the animal before you kill the animal. There are exceptions to this for religious purposes, for instance, but let's bracket those for now. If you apply a sort of a conception of rights, such as a Hofeldian conception of rights on which duties and claim rights correlate, here's a duty that's being imposed on humans not to slaughter animals without prior anesthesia. Therefore, the animal has a right to be killed with prior anesthesia, right? And if that's the lens you take, then animals are already rights holders. Okay, and they're not legal persons yet, but still have rights. So perhaps legal personhood then is a red herring. Maybe we should just work towards achieving more and stronger welfare rights, perhaps is what we might call them. So this is the other view that's out there now that's becoming increasingly prominent.
Yeah, that sounds plausible to me. I do acknowledge that certain animals already have certain rights, and it probably differs depending on the species of the animal. And I guess I'm okay with that. In principle, I'm not against it, right? As long as we care about animals, it seems that we should offer certain protections, right? It's usually us harming them, right? And so basically we need to protect them from our actions, which means that we impose on ourselves duties towards these animals. So yeah, I guess I don't have an issue with that. So we don't necessarily have to move them into the personhood category. They can be treated as things, but things with certain protections based on their capacities, perhaps. So maybe if you're focusing on animal welfare, then you should structure rights around the ways that they can suffer, right? So let's say certain animals are social. Maybe they have enough advanced cognitive capacities to suffer loneliness, or maybe I think I heard that elephants mourn their dead, or at least they seem like they mourn their dead, right? Okay, well then that makes them different, right? That makes them special, and we should accord them rights based on those particular capacities, but based on the capacities that allow them to suffer in certain ways, right? So if you're a simple animal and all you can feel is pleasure and pain, physical pleasure and pain, well, then maybe the rights that you're afforded are less than something, compared to a chimpanzee.
In principle, yes, but there's a catch, is what some animal rights scholars are saying here. And I have in mind Gary Francione in particular, who was one of the first sort of legal scholars writing on animal rights. He's a philosopher too, but he's made some really important contributions in the sort of second half of the 20th century. And his primary criticism of this particular approach is that it neglects the crucial role that property plays, right? So the idea here is, if you're a legal thing and not a legal person, then you are the property of persons, right? So things can be owned, but persons cannot be owned. That's why, slaves weren't recognized as persons, and they could be owned. They were legal things. And once they became legal persons, they could no longer be owned. So that's, the key idea behind, the thing-personhood divide. Now, if you are property, there are some practical, some economic constraints that are going to come with how many protections you are really going to be afforded, right? Because there does come a point where a piece of property, a thing, is protected so well that its owner can do nothing with it. It's economically useless to be the owner of that thing, right? So what we're seeing now effectively is sort of people approaching the issue from both sides. We have those who say, yeah, conceptually, there's no problem with granting more and stronger rights to animals as things based on, welfare considerations or other stuff, you were pointing to, Jason. And the more protections that we're giving them, the more rights even we're giving them, the more we're going to achieve something along the lines that Stephen Wise wants to achieve. It's just that, we don't need to talk about legal personhood. Legal personhood is a red herring. And the other camp that's saying you can't really do that because animals' property status is such a constraint that you're not actually gonna get there, right? You're gonna be prevented from giving, an animal a protection of the sort that would undermine its economic value to its owner. So the question really that we have now is, can you have something called living property? Is a proposal that David Faber, for instance, has put forward. Yeah, animals are things, but they have all sorts of rights. Or is living property really not legal personhood in, sort of different terminology? Because once you give animals those rights that make them economically useless, then you've effectively achieved what the legal personhood camp was going on about, all along. So in a sense, the two camps are also sort of, merging in a certain way.
I guess I don't necessarily see the problem with granting certain animals that particular status of living property. Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would call it living property, but I mean, what gives us the right to own an elephant or like a chimpanzee? Like, aren't those animals already like not unowned?
So this depends on the jurisdiction you're in. In some states, wild animals would be considered res nullius, or not belonging to anyone, or they could be seen as belonging to the state. They're just not privately owned yet. But many of the animals that we are talking about, specifically those on farms, they are, of course, privately owned animals.
That, I feel like, was the point of that type of concern, right? The issue is that we own a lot of animals. People own livestock, right? Because we eat meat, and so we have these slaughterhouses. And so if those animals cannot be owned, what does that mean for slaughterhouses? Well, they obviously can't be confined there, right? They're obviously, we're assuming that they're not, willing to be killed and eaten, right? And so that means that we just have to let them roam free in like a given territory.
Yeah, I think that would be one implication. Now, there are interesting proposals trying to flesh out what this would mean, because Francione and sort of early followers of his, they termed their approach abolitionism, right? and with sort of intentional reference to, abolitionism in the human context. And they were saying, look, this needs to stop. And in fact, these animals, domesticated animals that we're raising for food, they need to cease to exist, really, because, they're bred in a way, so they're entirely dependent on us, and that's unjust. So these creatures should cease to exist. And there are now more positive outlooks based on a sort of political turn in the literature that try to sketch what shared multi-species communities could look like, where we don't just get rid of these animals. They can continue to exist, continue to breed even, and we try to envisage ways of living together that are protecting all our rights.
Okay. So I kind of want to get to your proposal about species-based rights. What's your argument in favor of that?
So the argument is that there are good practical and political reasons for it. So just as a reminder, the argument is if you want to extend fundamental legal rights to some animals, say the right to bodily autonomy that we talked about earlier, or if you want to extend legal personhood to animals or other sort of legal protections, the emphasis on the legal here, then you should do so by looking at an animal's species. Is it part of the species of African elephant, for instance, or Asian elephant? If it does belong to a species that is recognized as holding that right, then that's all there is to it. You do not look into the individual's capacities. Is this particular individual elephant happy, say, autonomous or not? You don't go there. That is the argument. Now, why do I think this is a useful tool in the legal context? The practical argument for it is this. Judges are not zoologists, right? They're not good at knowing whether a given elephant has, relevant capacities. They don't have the time for it either. They've got loads of cases to deal with. What they're going to be doing is they're going to rely on, scientific studies that are going to be conducted on a sort of, species or population level. They're not about that particular individual, at least in most cases. They're about Asian elephants in general or African elephants in general. And the experts are going to tell us, yes, in general, these animals, they have autonomy, say. This is practically useful for the judge to do. They can also err on the safe side here. If they don't know whether happy is autonomous or not, they could just err on the side of including happy because the species as such, say, has been shown to be autonomous. This is the practical side, really quite sort of hands-on considerations for judges in a courtroom. The political side is this. It is politically useful to extend rights and personhood and what have you to animals on the basis of their species because it does two things. The first one is it allows us to extend better protections, fundamental rights, legal personhood, what have you, to non-human animals. And currently we're not doing that because of the anthropocentrism that we were talking about earlier. Fundamental rights, that is, rights that are akin to human rights, and legal personhood, they are, but for very limited exceptions that we can talk about, reserved for human beings only. So it allows us to go beyond that anthropocentrism, give some rights to non-human animals. But secondly, it manages to do that in a way that does not threaten or undermine the status and the rights of human beings who lack autonomy or have autonomy to a lesser extent than others, or, by extension, any other feature that could be taken to be grounding the relevant rights. In other words, my approach sort of upholds the egalitarianism that is central to human rights thinking and has been central at least since 1945, if not longer.
So do you take any stances in regards to what particular rights certain animals should possess?
I don't. So it is really a sort of a tool. And I think it is up to jurisdictions to decide which rights they want to give to which animal. Now, I do say a bit about how they should approach this, but the book itself doesn't say, okay, so chimpanzees need this and this and that right. That's not what the book is doing. It's more about giving a tool, an instrument to jurisdictions, political decision makers, lawyers who want to go down that road. The two yardsticks that it provides is the idea of merit and feasibility. So by merit, I mean extensions of fundamental rights, legal personhood, will depend on whether that given species has been shown to possess the relevant capacities, right? So you mentioned earlier the interesting example, Jason, of elephants grieving, right? If, as we now in fact know, this is part of a broader sort of trait and characteristic of elephants to be social, deeply social creatures, then prima facie, this would seem to suggest that elephants, African, Asian elephants, deserve maybe a right to family life, right? So this is the idea of merit. How much scientific backing do we have for a given interest, a given capacity in a given species? The more evidence we have, the more merit there is. That's the first element, merit. The second one is feasibility, and that's where you see the law and the politics come in again, right? So this one says, okay, so suppose we have, we've found out that chickens are incredibly intelligent, they're autonomous creatures, they certainly have an interest in not suffering, they have an interest in being alive, perhaps, in the sense of maybe they can, plan for the future, maybe they're autonomous in this sense. Suppose we had studies showing this. From a practical feasibility point of view, it is going to be very difficult to grant these types of rights to chickens because of how intensively we use and exploit and kill chickens for our own purposes. So chickens, say, they might sort of rank relatively highly on the merit level, and not so much on the feasibility. Whereas if you're looking at chimpanzees or elephants, you have very high merit for certain rights, but also very high feasibility, because from an economic point of view, we're just not as reliant on these animals. It depends on the country you're in, of course, but for the most part, the story will be quite different. So these are the two elements, the two tools that I provide, which will help decide which animals and which rights.
How do we determine if a particular species should not be confined to a small space? What capacities do they have to possess?
I suppose there's two ways of looking at this. The first one we've already talked about, which is autonomy. The second one would be something more indirect, I suppose. Do we see clear signs of suffering in this animal? Maybe they're losing their fur, or they're walking it around in circles. They show sort of stereotypical behavior, right? Based on which we could see or decide, well, this space in which the animal's being held captive is clearly too small, right? It might not actually show us that this animal has an interest in being free in the narrower sense, I suppose, but we could still use it to decide that this space is too small. I would venture to say that it is easier to do the latter, to sort of see if the animal is suffering more broadly, than to identify whether the animal is autonomous in the narrower sense. There's interesting philosophical work on this. Alistair Cochrane, for instance, wrote the book called Animal Rights Without Liberation, arguing that, in fact, most animals don't have an interest in autonomy in the strict sense. They might only benefit from autonomy in the sense of, a fox is suffering if you hold the fox captive because it's a wild animal, but we don't know whether the fox has the capacity to plan for the future, to make sort of choices as to how they want to, lead their lives. So there are these two different ways of looking at the matter, I would say.
This just raises deep philosophical questions. One that comes to mind is, how do we test if an animal is autonomous, right? And that goes back to, what do we mean by autonomous being? Do we mean just an animal that doesn't solely rely on instincts or react to external stimuli? I guess I'm not entirely sure what that means. And the second is what it means for an animal to suffer and how we're supposed to determine that. So it's an epistemological question, right? It's like, okay, well, let's say this parrot is like plucking its fur in the cage. It's like, okay, but does that mean that it's suffering? What does that actually mean? We're observing a behavior, right? But it's about our interpretation of that. And the reason why I think this is interesting and difficult is because we tend to anthropomorphize other animals' behaviors, right? It's like, oh, this animal is depressed, right? Like this parrot is suffering from depression, or maybe this parrot is suffering from anxiety. And it's like, really? Can a parrot suffer anxiety? But I hear pet owners talk like this about their pets all the time, right? And it's like, I don't know how much is actually true of the animal versus just you extrapolating that.
I think it's an excellent point, and animal rights advocates are acutely aware of it. It brings to mind an interesting book that the late Franz de Waal wrote recently, called "Are We Smart Enough to Understand How Smart Animals Are?" Right, and it precisely goes to this issue of sort of the risk of anthropomorphizing, behavior that we're seeing in animals that reminds us of something that, we know from the human context and that we interpret in a particular way. But also the risk of ignoring, I guess, the shared evolutionary history that we have with animals, with some more than with others, but, it certainly exists. And the scientists looking into this, I would say, sort of trying not to generalize too much here, are very much aware of this risk. And if anything, I would say they tend to shy away from anthropomorphizing, even when, and this was one of Franz de Waal's points, even when we have very good reasons for thinking that the behavior serves the same purpose, really, and should be interpreted in the same way as we do in the human context, right? And the reason why many scientists shy away from this is, I think, because of this awkwardness surrounding our supposedly special status, right? And what is perceived as an emotional way of, misunderstanding what animals are doing. And in fact, they're all very different from humans. And that's why we're not losing our special status at the top of the whatever hierarchy you wanna invoke. So it is difficult, but we're seeing a lot of progress, and I'm quite hopeful actually, and think the scientists looking into this are doing a good enough job. If anything, they're being a bit too cautious in my view, and I personally think Franz de Waal has got it right when he says that if there is a close shared evolutionary history between us and another animal, then when in doubt, you should actually anthropomorphize. It is only when we are further apart in evolutionary terms that we should be more hesitant to read something as being similar to a human behavior or human emotion or what have you, just because it looks similar.
Do you think that this issue is ultimately a technological problem? Like, it's an issue that could be solved with technology. And what I have in mind is lab-grown meat. I feel that once that becomes economically feasible, the issue of animal rights, maybe the majority of it, will kind of disappear. What do you think?
So I think there's two issues here. The first one is sort of the problem of other minds, right? So this, can we know what it feels like to be a bat, to use Tom Nagel's, famous article here? And I don't think we will ever be able to do that. So I don't think technology is going to help us with that unless you are if you are a bat, you're not going to know for sure what it is like to be a bat. Same with elephants, same with dogs, what have you. So there is this limitation that we will have, and that I think will stay there. But I don't think this means that we aren't able to understand what's happening to animals and the suffering that we are causing to them. If I kick my dog and the dog, sort of shouts and cries, I have a pretty good sense of what just happened and the suffering that I have imposed on him. Now, on the point about lab-grown meat, I think it's really interesting because what we're seeing is a technological development that is maybe overtaking, or at least working in parallel with, ethical arguments for, veganism. And vegans and animal rights folks sort of promoting vegan diets, they, I think, have sort of grown quite frustrated with the limited impact their often very good arguments have had on people. Yes, it's true, veganism is growing, but it could be growing at a much faster pace. I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, that something like lab-grown meat can really achieve the same outcome or a similar outcome, at least as far as animals is concerned, much more efficiently probably and much quicker than, distributing Peter Singer's animal liberation to everyone might.
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned with feasibility, as it seems that you are, most people enjoy eating meat. I think that if you were to kind of pick their brains on it and ask them why they do so, I think it really comes down to pleasure. We just find it pleasurable because they taste good. So given that most people are going to continue to eat meat, it seems that the most feasible option is give them lab-grown meat. Now, I understand that a lot of people find that gross, but I feel like a lot of people are going to be okay with that, especially if it tastes the same, the nutritional properties are the same. Maybe it's even healthier than meat from our factory farms.
And that would be easy, with all the hormones that go into factory farm meat. I'm all with you. I think Peter Singer recently went to Singapore and had some lab-grown meat and thought it was very good, and there's no ethical issues with it. At least certainly not the same kinds of issues that we have with factory farm meat. So by all means, as far as I'm concerned.
So I interviewed Gary Francione on my podcast, and we talked about his views on veganism and abolitionism. And one of the questions I asked him was, do you think it's intrinsically wrong to eat meat? My position was that it wasn't. So I gave the example of an animal that dies because a tree falls on it, right? Like, I think it would be perfectly fine to eat that meat. And his response was that, well, I just don't think that animals are things to be eaten, right? That was his response. So that tells me that it doesn't say, well, I haven't encountered an argument about the intrinsic wrongness of eating meat. I think it's intrinsically wrong to torture them and to put them in horrendous conditions so that we can eat them at an affordable cost, right? What do you think?
There are accounts that, support Francione's reasoning, but maybe on slightly different grounds. And the accounts I have in mind are more relational in nature than sort of individual sort of properties based. Because once the animal is dead, however sentient it might have been, we're no longer doing anything wrong to the animal on that sort of individualistic premise. But once you see the animal as being embedded in a family or perhaps a broader society, then it matters what we are doing with the corpse of an animal, because now you're starting to eat someone's friend, or someone who was a citizen in a political community, and now the picture changes. And I have sympathy with this. In fact, I think this is a promising way to go. It talks about the respect or lack thereof that animals currently have, because we're willing or more willing to eat them if a tree falls on them than we would be another human being. And we should be asking ourselves, why are we why are we less willing to eat the human, as I think maybe your intuition would be too, Jason? It would be mine too, I think, even though I believe in animal rights. So what's going on here? And so as much as I earlier said, lab-grown meat is great, at the same time, I also think that, Francione's got a point here, but I think you can hold these views at the same time. And I think in contrast with Francione and some others, it is dangerous to reject something like lab-grown meat just in order to preserve a sort of pure point of view and perhaps a utopian world that we're never going to get to unless we make some baby steps along the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense to me. My concern is that if we are going to base our ethical behavior on how we relate to other animals, then it's going to be very dependent on the actual culture. It's going to be dependent on the times, right? And so I feel like it's maybe a better bet to base it on the particular capacities of those animals. So, I mean, obviously most people are going to be more, or at least most people who are in the West are going to be more resistant to eating dogs and cats, right? Because we relate to them in particular ways. We see them as part of our families because they're our pets, right? But I don't know if that is the right way to ground our ethical obligations in regards to treating other animals. Because what makes a dog so special compared to like a chimpanzee or like a lizard or something like that, right? So if it's just based on, oh well, yeah, we just like them more though, yeah, that's not a strong moral foundation.
And would you take that same view for humans, Jason? Would you say, well, if a tree fell on a human, I'm curious because this would be the implication, right? So unless they were your friend or sort of close-ish relative, and we take a purely capacities-based view, would you accept that conclusion for humans? And if not, what's sort of driving your instincts there?
I think it's ultimately aesthetic. I just think it's gross. And I would say the same thing about lab-grown human meat. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with eating that, but I just think it's gross.
I think it's a great point. The aesthetics, the revulsion, because I think it ties in with culture too, right? What we find revolting is deeply connected to how we were raised, the sort of, broader culture we are in. And yeah, I find it compelling because it ties in with this broader notion. And once a culture changes, and in fact, this certainly applies to me, and I'm sure other people too who lead a sort of plant-based life, they find it revolting to eat, animal flesh, right? Because that's exactly it. You don't look at it as, a piece of meat anymore, a steak. It is animal flesh, right? So yes, I think perceptions change, and they can change what we are willing to do, whatever its morality.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of vegetarians and vegans just find the idea of eating, animal corpses disgusting. And I can understand that. But again, that's not necessarily a moral argument, right? That's an aesthetic argument. So you're approaching this, or your proposal is to have a rights system based on species membership. Okay. So let's say we get to the point where we genetically engineer pigs so that their litter lacks certain capacities. They're still alive, but they're just really dumb, maybe. They're almost like not really pigs capacity wise. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting one, and it's an idea that Jeff Skopek has introduced to in the literature. I follow Jeff here in thinking that probably the best response to this is one on sort of virtue ethics grounds, because you are dealing with an animal that doesn't have the capacity to sort of suffer by definition, by the way you construe the example, and that makes it hard to sort of find a sort of deontological angle too. So really probably the problem was with creating these kinds of beings in the first place. Maybe that's telling us more about you, the creator, and what you did wrong than the animal as such. But maybe just to take a step back here, the species membership approach, it is not meant to be a morally ideal or even a morally sort of right theory as such. it is meant to be a practical proposal that takes inspiration from the sort of meritocratic animal rights views, but also sort of draws out their limitations and their problems by drawing on opposing what I call aristocratic human rights arguments. So it's saying, look, we've got these two opposing conceptions of rights. Let's adopt a practical middle ground between these two. This practical middle ground is not going to be able to give a morally compelling solution to all kinds of potential examples that we might come up. And we have to go back to the philosophy to see if we've got any good sort of answers to the kinds of scenarios you've developed. But that's not to say that the species membership approach cannot be a very useful and expedient tool in the case of very many animals.
All right, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.